On a Friday morning in September of 1994, a woman named Constance Aldrich stood in the doorway of her mother's barn in Hardin County, Ohio, and watched two men from an estate liquidation company price 31 years of her mother's work at the rate of about 40 cents per hour. The auctioneer hadn't arrived yet. These were just the pricing men, the ones who came 3 days early with their clipboards and their digital camera and their practiced indifference, moving through a dead woman's belongings the way water moves through a field, touching everything and understanding nothing. Constance was 52 years old. She had driven 6 hours from Pittsburgh the night before and had slept badly in her childhood bedroom and was standing there with $400 in her checking account and a credit card she was not supposed to use for anything other than emergencies, wondering how she was going to define the word emergency before Monday morning. She almost didn't get the chance. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you about Eloise Aldrich first, because you cannot understand what her daughter found in that barn without understanding the woman who built it. Eloise Aldrich had come to Hardin County as a bride in 1951, 23 years old, following a husband named Harold who had inherited 80 acres of corn and soybean ground from his own father and who had the good sense to recognize, within the first year of their marriage, that his wife understood the land better than he did. Harold was not a prideful man in the way that makes such recognitions difficult. He simply watched Eloise walk the fields in the evening, watched her crouch down and study the soil between her fingers, watched her come back to the house with an expression of absolute concentration that he associated with people solving problems they found genuinely interesting. And he understood that she was not decorating his farm. She was reading it. Harold died in 1972 of a stroke that came on a Tuesday evening while he was watching the news, quiet and sudden, the way strokes sometimes are. He was 51 years old. Eloise was 44, and she had 2 daughters and 80 acres, and the barn full of equipment, and the particular kind of grief that does not have the luxury of being only grief. She farmed those 80 acres alone for the next 22 years. Her older daughter, Patricia, had married a man from Columbus and wanted nothing to do with farming. Constance, the younger one, had gone to Pittsburgh for a job in quality control at a ceramics manufacturer and had built a life there that was good and complete and located entirely elsewhere. Neither of them had meant to leave their mother alone with the land. That is how it happens most of the time. You don't decide to leave, you just keep not coming back. What Eloise did with her time in the years after Harold died was not what most people in Hardin County knew about, because Eloise was not a woman who talked about herself at any length or with any particular enthusiasm. What people knew was that she kept the farm running, that she was precise about her crop rotations, that she never asked the county extension office for advice she hadn't already arrived at herself, and that she occasionally disappeared into the barn for entire evenings and came out again with her hands dark with something that was not quite soil. What she was actually doing was what Constance discovered on the Friday before the estate sale. The barn was a standard Ohio bank barn, tall and red and built sometime in the 1890s, with a lower level that Harold had converted into a workshop space in the 1960s by pouring a concrete floor and running electrical along the ceiling joists. The workshop took up roughly a third of the lower level. The rest was storage. Eloise had used Harold's workshop after Harold was gone in a way that Harold had not anticipated when he built it. Constance had not been inside the workshop in years. She had been to the farm at Christmas, had helped with small things in the house, had not thought carefully about what her mother did in the barn after dark. When the estate attorney told her the contents of the property would need to be liquidated, she had agreed the way you agree to things that feel inevitable, without examining the specifics. She examined them now. The workshop along the north wall was maybe 30 feet long and covered with tools that Constance, who had spent 28 years in manufacturing quality control, recognized immediately as specialized, not general purpose, not the kind of thing you accumulated by accident. There were soil sampling tools, some of them clearly commercial, some of them clearly modified, with handles reshaped and probe tips filed to dimensions that were not standard. There was a bench-mounted microscope, old but clean and calibrated, with a series of prepared slides in a wooden rack beside it, each one labeled in Eloise's small, upright handwriting. There were jars arranged along the back of the bench, maybe 60 of them, each containing a soil sample labeled with a location code and a date, and the dates went back to 1973, 1 year after Harold died. She had started 1 year after Harold died, and she had not stopped. There were binders, 11 of them, each one labeled on the spine in the same upright handwriting. Constance pulled one from the shelf and opened it. What she found inside were field observation records, meticulous ones, covering a single section of the farm over a period of 4 years. Moisture readings, compaction measurements at 3 depths, organic matter estimates using a method that Constance did not immediately recognize, but which referenced a procedure Eloise had apparently developed herself based on something she had read in the University Extension Bulletin in 1975 and then modified because she felt the original method didn't account correctly for the clay content in Hardin County soils. There were photographs taken with a 35mm camera of soil profiles at different times of year. There were comparisons. There were conclusions, stated plainly, with the evidence laid out in columns. Constance stood at that bench for nearly 2 hours. She was not a soil scientist. She was a quality control specialist. But quality control is, at its root, the practice of measuring things carefully, noticing patterns, and understanding why the patterns deviate from what you expect. She knew what she was looking at. She was looking at 31 years of systematic observation of 80 acres of Ohio farmland, conducted by a woman with a 10th grade education and a bench-mounted microscope and a commitment to understanding her ground that had apparently not required an audience or a credential or a prudential or a paycheck. The pricing men had been through the workshop before Constance arrived. She found their sticker on the binder shelf. Everything on the north bench, tools included, the microscope, the soil sample jars, the slides, and all 11 binders. One price for the lot. The sticker said $75. Constance stood there a long time looking at that sticker. She had worked for 28 years in a field where the difference between understanding your materials and not understanding them was the difference between a product that held together and one that didn't. She understood systematic observation the way her mother had understood soil from the inside without having to explain it. She knew what 11 binders of field-level soil data represented to the right person. She knew what the sample jars represented. She also knew something the pricing men did not and could not know because they had not read the binders. She knew what her mother had been trying to figure out. Let me tell you what Eloise Aldrich had actually been building in that workshop, because it is not what you would expect from a widow farming 80 acres alone in Hardin County, Ohio. Eloise had not been keeping records for the sake of keeping records. Eloise had a problem, and the problem had a specific shape, and she had spent 3 decades trying to understand its dimensions precisely enough to solve it. The problem was a 14-acre section in the northeast corner of her property that had underperformed consistently since before Harold bought the farm. Everyone who had ever farmed that ground had accepted the underperformance as a given, a characteristic of the field, as permanent and unexplained as the shape of it. Harold had accepted it. His father had accepted it. The county extension office, when Eloise had asked them about it once in 1974, had used the word hardpan and moved on. Eloise had not accepted it, or rather, she had accepted it as a problem worth solving, and had started, in the winter of 1973, trying to understand precisely what was wrong. What she found, over the course of the following decade, was that the hardpan explanation was incomplete. There was compaction, yes, but the compaction was not uniform, and the pattern of non-uniformity corresponded to something she eventually identified by cross-referencing old county plat maps with her own soil profiles. There had been a drainage tile system installed on that section sometime in the 1910s, and portions of it had failed, and the failure had created wet pockets that froze and expanded in winter and compacted differentially from the surrounding soil. And the pattern of that differential compaction was the actual cause of the yield variation, not the hardpan itself. This was not a finding she could have arrived at without the binders. Without 11 years of readings at consistent points across the field, through multiple seasons, cross-referenced against her own drainage maps and the county's historical tile records, the pattern would have been invisible. It had been invisible to everyone who had looked at that field before her, because they had not looked at it for 11 years in a row. By the time she wrote her conclusion in Binder 7, in the fall of 1984, she had also worked out a remediation plan. She could not afford to implement it. The plan required rerouting a section of drainage tile, and the equipment and labor cost was beyond what the farm's operating margins could absorb at the time. So she had continued observing, refining, documenting the ongoing effects of the drainage failure, and had added a cost-benefit analysis in Binder 9 that she had apparently updated every 3 years. Constance found the most recent update in Binder 11. The date on it was March of 1994. 6 months before her mother died. Her mother had updated the cost-benefit analysis 6 months before she died, and the conclusion was that with current tile-laying equipment costs and current soybean prices, the remediation was now economically viable. She had written the word viable in her small, upright handwriting and underlined it once. Constance sat down on the concrete floor of her mother's workshop with Binder 11 in her lap and sat there until the light changed. The estate sale was on Monday. Constance went back to the farmhouse, called her sister Patricia in Columbus, and tried to explain what was in the binders. Patricia listened carefully and then said she appreciated that it seemed important, but that the estate attorney had already arranged everything and she wasn't sure what Constance was proposing to do about it. Constance was not entirely sure either. She told Patricia she was going to be at the sale Monday and she was going to handle the workshop contents herself. Patricia said that was fine as long as it didn't complicate the estate process, and Constance said it wouldn't, and then she called her bank and asked what her credit limit was and wrote the number down on the margin of the estate attorney's information sheet. Let me tell you about what happened at that estate sale, because it is not a simple story. The sale drew around 40 people, which was a reasonable crowd for a farm estate in Hardin County in September, mostly neighbors, a few dealers who worked the estate sale circuit in that part of Ohio and who had a professional's eye for things that moved quickly, 2 men from a farm equipment company in Findlay who were there for a grain auger that Harold had bought in 1968 and which was, incongruously, still functional. Constance had been watching the workshop area since the sale opened at 8. There were 2 people besides herself who seemed to be taking more than casual notice of the north bench. One was a man in his early 60s in a green jacket who had spent a quiet 10 minutes looking at the microscope before the sale started and had not touched anything but had looked at each soil sample jar in sequence with the particular patience of someone reading a library catalog. The other was a younger woman, maybe 40, in a university extension office jacket, which Constance found significant. People from the extension office do not come to estate sales by accident. The auctioneer reached the workshop bench at 10:15. Constance checked her phone when he said the words North Bench, Tools and Equipment, because she knew this was the moment, and she wanted the time fixed clearly in her memory. He described the lot the way auctioneers describe things when the details are beyond their expertise. Miscellaneous soil testing equipment, bench microscope, sample jars, reference binders, general small tools. He opened at $25. The man in the green jacket bid. Constance bid. The woman from the extension office bid. The man bid again. Constance bid. The extension office woman bid to $125. The man in the green jacket looked at Constance. Constance looked at him. She had her hands in her coat pockets, and she was not moving, and something in her stillness apparently communicated itself, because when the auctioneer called for $150, the man in the green jacket glanced once more at the binder shelf and then gave a small sideways tilt of his head, barely visible, and was quiet. The extension office woman bid $150. Constance bid $175. The extension office woman looked at Constance with an expression that was not unfriendly and not competitive. Exactly, but thoughtful. And then she did not bid again. The gavel came down, $175. Constance Aldrich bought 31 years of her mother's work for less than the hourly rate she charged her employer for overtime, because nobody else at that sale understood what they were looking at fully enough to go higher, and because the two people who came closest both stopped for reasons she never entirely learned. Let me tell you what Constance did next, because the sale is not where this story turns. She loaded everything into her Subaru on Monday afternoon. The microscope in its case, the sample jars wrapped in newspaper, the slides in their wooden rack, the tools, and all 11 binders. She drove back to Pittsburgh and carried it into her apartment, where it occupied her dining room table and most of her floor for the following 2 weeks, while she figured out what to do with it. She had not bought it for investment purposes. She had bought it because she could not stand the thought of 11 binders going to the extension office or to the man in the green jacket or to anyone who would use the data without knowing whose hands had made it and what question those hands had been trying to answer for 31 years. But sitting in her Pittsburgh apartment on a dining room table, it was not answering anything either. So Constance started reading from the beginning, all 11 binders. She read in the evenings after work and on weekends, and it took her the better part of October. She was reading technical material, which was familiar to her professionally, but these were not technical documents in the way she was used to. They were something more personal than that. They were the record of a woman reasoning her way through a problem out loud on paper, with no audience assumed and no credential behind her name, just the problem and the data and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that not understanding was unacceptable. Delos had been wrong sometimes and had written down the ways she'd been wrong. She had revised her methods twice in 11 years and had explained her reasoning both times. She had developed an approach to reading soil compaction from surface indicators that was, as far as Constance could determine, original, not derived from a manual. Derived from a manual, derived from looking at the same 14 acres season after season until the surface told her what was happening below. Constance finished binder 11 at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning in November and sat there a long time with her coffee going cold. Then she called a man named Dale Morrow. Dale ran the agronomy program at a small agricultural college in Wooster, Ohio, and Constance had met him once at a conference years ago and had kept his card because he had said something at that conference about field-level soil observation that had stuck with her. She told Dale what was in the binders. Dale was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be meaningful. Then he said, "I need you to bring those binders to Wooster." Constance brought the binders. Dale spent a Saturday afternoon going through them at his office desk, turning pages the way you turn pages when you're afraid to go too fast and miss something. At one point, he stopped and looked up at Constance across the desk and said, "Your mother built a longitudinal data set. You understand what that means? 31 years of consistent measurement at fixed points on the same ground. There's maybe a handful of research stations in this country that have data sets this long on a single field, and those are funded operations with graduate students. Your mother did this herself." He went back to reading. When he set the last binder down, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "What are you going to do with these?" Constance said she wasn't sure yet. Dale said, "Whatever you do, don't let them sit in a box." Let me tell you about the winter of 1994 and 1995, because that is when Constance Aldrich made a decision that changed the shape of what came after. She had worked in quality control for 28 years. She was good at it. She had a salary and a pension. She was 5 years from vesting, and a one-bedroom apartment in Pittsburgh she had lived in for 11 years and no particular reason to change any of it. She was also 52 years old and aware, in the specific way that 52 makes you aware of things, that she had spent 28 years catching errors in other people's processes and had never, not once, felt the particular satisfaction she recognized in her mother's binders, the satisfaction of a person working on a problem they chose for themselves, for reasons that needed no external justification. Constance left the ceramics manufacturer in March of 1995. She moved back to Hardin County, back to the farmhouse she had grown up in and which the estate had not yet sold, and she spent that spring implementing her mother's drainage remediation plan on the 14-acre section in the northeast corner. The cost came in within 4% of Eloise's most recent estimate. Constance noted this in a new binder she had started, the same kind of composition format her mother had used, with the same measurement points, continuing the data set forward. The first harvest from that section, in the fall of 1995, yielded 19% above the field's historical average. Constance wrote this down in the new binder without excitement, the way her mother would have written it, as a data point that confirmed a hypothesis that had been 31 years in development. She called Dale Morrow in October and told him the number. He was quiet again for the significant kind of moment. Then he said, "Constance, I want to talk to you about something." What Dale wanted to talk about was the data set. He'd been thinking about it since the Saturday in Worcester, and what he wanted to do was work with Constance to write it up in a form that other agronomists and extension agents and farmers could use. Not a research paper exactly, something more practical, a field-level methodology document showing how a single operator, without institutional resources, could build the kind of longitudinal soil understanding that typically required a funded research program. Using Eloise's binders as the foundation and Constance's remediation results as proof of concept. Constance said she would think about it. She thought about it for a week and then said yes. They spent the winter of 1995 and the winter of 1996 working on it. Constance drove to Worcester twice a month, and they sat at Dale's desk for hours going through the binders and working out how to present what Eloise had figured out in language that was precise enough to be useful without requiring a graduate degree to understand. The document they produced ran to 114 pages. Dale's college printed it and distributed it through their extension network. They priced it at $15. The first run of 300 copies sold out in 6 weeks. They printed 600 more. Constance received letters from farmers in 9 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Several of them described finding the same drainage-related compaction patterns on their own ground once they knew what to look for. One of them, a woman in central Illinois, wrote to say she had identified a nearly identical situation on a section of her family's farm that had underperformed since her grandfather's time, and that she was beginning to wonder how many fields like that existed in the Midwest, carrying yield losses that nobody had connected to a solvable cause because nobody had looked at them consistently for long enough. Constance thought about that letter for a long time. She thought about it in the way you think about things that are trying to show you something larger than what you first saw. Let me tell you about the woman from the extension office. Her name was Sandra Pruitt, and she was 40 years old in September of 1994, and she'd worked for the Hardin County Extension Office for 11 years. She had gone to the Aldrich estate sale the way she went to most farm estate sales in the county, professionally, looking for equipment the office might acquire or information that might be relevant to what she knew about local farming practices. She had heard of Eloise Aldrich in the way you hear of someone in a small county, not closely, but continuously. She knew Eloise had farmed alone since the early 70s and had a reputation for precision, the kind that county neighbors notice and mention in the particular tone that means they're not entirely sure whether to respect it or find it excessive. When she saw the north bench, Sandra had recognized that the binders were unusual. She had opened one and understood within 10 minutes that she was looking at something that was not routine. She had bid to 150 because 150 was her professional judgment of what the data was worth to the extension office as a resource. She had stopped at 150 partly because of budget and partly because of the woman across the lot who had not moved or spoken, but who had the expression of someone who is not bidding on data. She was bidding on something else. Sandra had recognized that difference and had let it mean what it meant. Sandra thought about that sale for months. She thought about it the way you think about a decision you made correctly, but for reasons that are worth examining. She had the right expertise to use the binders. She had a professional mandate to do exactly the kind of work those binders were designed to support, and she had let a 52-year-old ceramics quality control specialist outbid her for them, and she had been right to do it, and she was not certain she could explain exactly why. She found out about the methodology document through the extension network in the spring of 1996. She read it in 2 sittings. She called a number on the back page, which was a farm number in Hardin County, and Constance answered. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Sandra asked questions that were specific and informed, the questions of someone who understood the methodology from the inside, and Constance answered them the way her mother had written things down, plainly and with the evidence. At the end of the conversation, Sandra said, "I should have bid higher at the sale." Constance said, "You would have taken them somewhere they got used. That's not nothing." Sandra said, "I would have taken them somewhere they got filed." There was a pause. Constance said, "Then I'm glad I bid higher." That was the plainest either of them got about what had happened at the auction, and it was enough. Let me tell you about what happened between Sandra Pruitt and Constance Aldrich in the years that followed, because it is quieter than you might expect and more useful. Sandra did not become Constance's partner or her advocate or her friend in the way that makes for a clean resolution. What she became was a channel. When farmers came to the extension office with chronic yield problems that the standard diagnostic approaches hadn't solved, problems that looked like soil variability but didn't respond to the usual interventions, Sandra started sending them to the farmhouse in Hardin County. Not officially, informally, the way knowledge moves in places where people trust each other's competence more than they trust institutional process. Constance started a new data set on a neighbor's farm in 1997. She started 2 more in 1990. By 2001, she had active observation programs on 7 different farms in 3 Ohio counties, all of them farms with chronic problem sections that had been accepted as permanent, all of them farms whose operators had decided, after reading the methodology document or hearing about it from Sandra or from another farmer, that not understanding was worth reconsidering. She trained no one formally. She had no credential to confer. What she did was bring people out to the Aldrich Northeast section and show them binder 1 through binder 11, and then binders 12 through 16, which were hers, and then the harvest records for the section before and after the remediation. She let the data make the argument. She found that farmers who had spent their lives reading land did not need the argument explained at length. They needed to see that it was possible. Then they understood it the way her mother had understood soil, not by being told, but by recognizing something they already knew how to see. Let me tell you about the fall morning in 2003, when a young man came to the farmhouse. His name was Joel, and he was 24 years old, and he had just finished an agronomy degree at Ohio State. He was also Constance's nephew, Patricia's oldest son, who had grown up visiting the farm and spending summers helping with whatever needed doing, and who had developed, in the particular way that young people absorb things they're around long enough, an understanding of the observation work that was deeper than he knew he had. Joel sat down at the kitchen table and told Constance he had been thinking about where to go next. He said he had been looking at precision agriculture technology, the GPS-guided sampling systems that were starting to reach farms at a price point that made sense, and he thought there was a gap between what the technology could measure and what it would take to interpret the measurements correctly. He said most agronomists using precision sampling tools were generating data faster than anyone knew how to use it. He said someone needed to build a framework for interpreting multi-year precision soil data in the way his grandmother's binders interpreted manual data. He said he thought the methodology document was the foundation for that framework, and he wanted to build it. Constance looked at her nephew for a moment. She thought about a Friday morning in September of 1994, and a workshop bench and 11 binders and a woman who had spent 31 years measuring the same 14 acres because she had decided that one underperforming field was worth understanding completely. She thought about what it had cost to almost let that disappear and what it had required to save it. She said, "Start with the Northeast section. I have 29 years of data on it now. Bring your equipment and we'll see what the GPS sampling adds to what we already know." Joel said, "You want me to run the new system against the historical manual records?" Constance said, "I want you to find out whether 30 years of someone looking carefully at the same ground is more or less precise than one season of the satellite telling you what it sees. Then I want you to write that down." Joel spent the next 3 years working on that question. The answer he arrived at was that they were not comparable at all, that they were measuring different things, and that the most accurate picture of a field's behavior came from combining them. He wrote this up, with Constance's data and his own, and published it first as an extension bulletin and then as a journal article that got more attention than he expected. The acknowledgments page thanked Eloise Aldrich by name and described her as an independent field researcher in Hardin County, Ohio, which was not a title she had ever held or sought, but which was, Constance thought when she read it, accurate. Constance retired from active farm management in 2011 when she was 69. She handed the Aldrich Observation Program to Joel and spent her retirement doing what her mother had spent 31 years doing, walking fields, taking measurements, writing things down in composition binders that she kept on a shelf in the farmhouse workshop above the bench where Harold's tools still hung on their hooks. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't close with Constance. Let me tell you about Sandra Pruitt's last appearance in it, because it matters. Sandra retired from the Extension office in 2008 at 54 and moved to a small property in Wyandotte County, where she kept a large garden and did consulting work for farms that couldn't afford formal agronomy services. She had spent 25 years in Extension work. She had never, in all that time, simply spent a season watching a single piece of ground for its own sake. She started at 54. It was not the same as what Eloise had done. Sandra had formal training that Eloise had lacked, and she had access to equipment Eloise had improvised around, and she had the methodology document as a starting point rather than building from nothing. But she started a binder, one composition notebook, the same kind, with the same format of measurement points and dates and observations and questions written in the margins when something didn't fit the pattern she expected. She brought the binder to the Aldrich farmhouse one afternoon in 2010 and set it on the table. Constance looked at it without picking it up. Then she looked at Sandra. Sandra said, "I wanted you to see it." Constance said, "How long have you been at it?" Sandra said, 2 years. Constance nodded. She said, "What did you find?" Sandra opened the binder to a page near the middle. She said there was a corner of her property that drained oddly in heavy rain, not where she would have expected from the topography. She had been measuring soil moisture at 12 points around that corner for 2 years, and the pattern didn't match the surface grade. She thought there might be an old field tile under there that was partially blocked. She said she wasn't certain yet. She needed another season. Constance said, "You'll know by fall." Sandra said, "That's what I thought." She drove home that afternoon with her binder on the passenger seat. She did find the tile. It was partially collapsed, not blocked, and the remediation was simpler than she had expected. She wrote up the finding in the binder, in the same plain way that Eloise had written things down, what had been wrong, what had fixed it, what she had almost concluded but hadn't, and why. Sandra's property was sold after she died in 2016. Her daughter found the binder in the garden shed and almost threw it away before she noticed the handwriting inside was precise and organized and went back further than one season. She read it for 20 minutes standing in the shed doorway, and then she brought it inside. It is not in Hardin County. The Aldrich binders are. But somewhere in Wyandotte County there is a composition notebook on a shelf that represents the beginning of something that did not have time to become what it might have been, written by a woman who spent 25 years directing other people toward the kind of attention she finally gave herself in the last 6 years of her life. Eloise Aldrich's northeast section is still farmed. Joel manages the observation program now. The data set is 42 years old. There is no other single-field longitudinal soil data set of comparable length in private hands in Ohio, and possibly in the country, though no one has done the accounting to be certain. It started because a widow in Hardin County decided that one underperforming field was not a permanent condition but an unanswered question, and spent 31 years building the tools to answer it, and wrote everything down in a language her daughter could read. Some questions take longer than a lifetime to answer completely. The ones worth asking usually do. I keep thinking about that sticker. $75. 2 men with clipboards walked through 31 years of someone's most careful work, and they put a sticker on it that said $75, and then they moved on to the next shelf. They weren't cruel people. They were just people who had not read the binders. That's the part that stays with me. Not the injustice of the price, though that's real. What stays with me is how close it came to simply disappearing. One more estate sale with no one in the room who knew what they were looking at, and Eloise Aldrich's northeast section would still be underperforming today, for the same reason it underperformed when Harold's father farmed it, because the question she spent 31 years answering would have died with her notebooks in a filing cabinet somewhere. What Constance did at that auction wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct exactly, it was the result of a specific kind of honesty that most of us find difficult to practice consistently. She looked at what was on that bench, and she told herself the truth about what she was seeing, even though the truth was inconvenient, even though it cost her money she didn't really have, even though it meant driving back to a life she had spent 30 years keeping at a comfortable distance. That kind of honesty is harder than it sounds. It's easier to let the price tag tell you what something is worth. And then there is what Eloise did, which is a different kind of thing entirely. Eloise didn't have a credential, or a budget, or an audience. She had a 14-acre field that nobody had ever bothered to understand, and she decided that was unacceptable, and she spent 31 years building the tools to understand it herself. That is not a small thing to decide. Most of us accept the underperforming sections of our lives the way Harold's family accepted that field, as permanent, as given, as not worth the cost of a real answer. Eloise decided the cost of not knowing was higher. She was right, and the proof of it took 3 decades to arrive, which means she never doubted the work during all the years when there was no proof yet. That kind of steadiness, the kind that keeps you measuring the same 12 points on a cold morning in November when no one is watching, and the result won't matter for another decade, that is not something you can fake or borrow. You either build it slowly or you don't have it. What I find myself returning to is the cost-benefit analysis in Binder 9, updated every 3 years, updated 6 months before she died, with the word viable underlined once. She kept working on it even when she couldn't implement it, even when the numbers didn't pencil out, even when there was no particular reason to believe the moment would come when they would. She kept the knowledge current, because the knowledge was worth keeping current. That is what integrity looks like when no one is grading it. Constance inherited the land, but what she really inherited was the habit of attention, the willingness to sit with a problem long enough to see it clearly. She passed that on to Joel, and Joel built something from it that neither of them could have built alone, and somewhere in Wyandotte County there is a notebook on a shelf that represents the beginning of something Sandra Pruitt finally gave herself permission to start at 54. The chain doesn't require a grand moment to continue. It requires someone in each generation who looks at what's in front of them and decides that understanding it is worth the time. That is not a complicated idea. It is just a difficult one to live.